G'day, eh? My name's RJ. This is Killer Canuck, and together, we're looking through Canada's horror history. They say the best way to predict the future is by studying the past, and filmmakers have been doing so for decades. All lovingly stealing from each other, aspects of one another's work is present in almost every artist's filmography. Whether that be a particular shot, theme, line, or what have you, the idea of something completely original is almost out of the question.
This really comes to a head in regards to remakes. Except in a very few cases, even the term remake can send your eyes rolling to the back of your head. This is especially true when it comes to horror, you nod as you imagine Vince Vaughn in Anthony Perkins' shoes. Horror fans are undeniably the most passionate in the industry and will stand by something tooth and nail regardless of its perceived critical quality. So when Hollywood has the sheer audacity to get their greedy mitts on something so sacred as a horror classic, it's an uphill battle for the filmmakers right from the start. Remakes aren't anything new, they date back almost as far as film itself, but to modern audiences, the modern remake lives in that transitional period at the turn of the millennium. There were a few in the late 90s, films like The Haunting and House on Haunted Hill in 1999, and that shot-for-shot abomination that was the Psycho remake in 98, but the majority of remakes that modern audiences remember were released in a 12-year span from 2001 to 2013. Remember the time period. After Wes Craven revamped the horror genre in 96 with Scream, what followed in the few years after were basically just films trying to copy him. Then, after 9/11, we get the birth of the torture porn era, which would dominate the genre essentially from the release of Saw in 2004 until around 2013.
Game over.
In here we see the release of 7 Saw films, Eli Roth's Hostel series, Serdan Spasojević's A Serbian film, and the start of the Human Centipede trilogy. Pair this with the emergence of the new French extremity with films like Alexandre Aja's Haute Tension, Xavier Jeans's Frontières, and Pascal Laugier's Martyrs, and you have a grim and gruesome decade.
As a more casual horror fan, if you can't palate this new dominant style of horror filmmaking, what are you left with? Sure, the 80s will always have your back, but for the most part, you're left with movies designed to burn through teen wallets and PG-13 horror remakes.
You could maybe point to the success of Gore Verbinski's remake of The Ring as a jumping off point, but it felt like every major horror franchise got a remake or a reboot or re-whatever in the 2000s. This wouldn't necessarily be a problem except for the fact that nearly all of these imitations lacked the heart and creativity of their predecessor. We got a cold, flat decade full of dickish characters that were more content with chirping one another than being complex or interesting, and a series of films in which we all knew exactly what was going to happen because they reused all the same shots and set pieces of the originals. To which most of us simply asked, why? Then, in 2013, we saw 2 important releases. James Wan, the shining beacon of hope that led us into the dark of the torture porn era, continued to lead us out with the release of The Conjuring, and Fede Alvarez showed everyone what a true remake could be with Evil Dead. This coincided with the rise of Blumhouse, who had had massive success with 2009's Paranormal Activity, and Wan had already directed 2011's Insidious. The series of hits that followed, including but not limited to The Purge, Sinister, Lords of Salem, and Oculus, also fueled this sort of horror renaissance. Then, Whiplash won 3 awards at the Oscars, and suddenly Blumhouse was a household name. The Conjuring's slow burn, atmospheric horror led us into what the genre resembles now in 2021, as well as started its own cinematic universe. Evil Dead flipped the script, not just its own, but the one being used for making horror remakes, opting for a more serious take on Sam Raimi's classic. Sure, the set pieces were the same, but we were looking at them through new eyes.
While the outstanding quality of the film certainly helps, what's most important is that Alvarez did something different with the source material. Not content with the numbers that would come with sharing the namesake, Alvarez gave us a new protagonist that didn't have the impossible task of filling Bruce Campbell's iconic shoes, as well as a more grounded use for the original's penchant for excessive blood.
Remakes have since slowed down, likely due to audiences' inundation and oversaturation to them, but I like to hope that the past decade has made filmmakers realize that they have to try a little harder to stand on the shoulders of the giants who came before them. So, what does all this have to do with Canadian horror? Well, 2019 saw the release of the first ever remake of David Cronenberg's work, Rabid, directed by Canadian twins Jen and Sylvia Soska. This is interesting because the only other remake of a Canadian work by a Canadian that I can think of off the top of my head is The Grand Seduction from 2013.
With an evident reverence for Cronenberg and his body of work, the Soska's remake of Rabid is similar enough to the source material to warrant its namesake, but different enough to be intriguing. The original was done in 1977 by a straight male atheist whose marriage was falling apart, and the remake was done 42 years later by pansexual twin females who were in touch with their spirituality. Talk about different gazes.
Now, what's the difference between the 2 films? The Soskas were very aware that they were remaking a classic, and they let the audience know immediately.
Why do we keep remaking old trends?
Our lead is still Rose, played this time by Jigsaw actor and fellow Canadian Laura Vandervoort, but this iteration stands on her own. She has her own job and her own life. In fact, Rose's character and her decision-making is what drives the plot forward. Instead of being acted upon like the beginning of the original, it's this Rose's own decisions that ultimately lead to her accident. The The character of Hart, played here by Canadian actor Ben Hollingsworth, is changed from her ineffective boyfriend to a co-worker crush, and the character of Mindy, named Chelsea in the remake and played by Canadian actor Hanneke Talbot, is introduced in the beginning as opposed to halfway through. Rose works for fashion icon Gunter, played by Canadian actor Mackenzie Gray. She wears glasses and that makes her unattractive and not very confident. She agrees to go to a party later that night with hunky co-worker Brad Hart. While in the bathroom there, she finds out from a pair of bodysuit-clad coke-snorting Canadian twin cameos that her date was a setup by Chelsea, her friend and adopted sister. Leaving in embarrassment, she doesn't look both ways, and so she gets mucked by oncoming traffic. At the hospital, Dr. Keloid, played by Canadian horror mainstay Stephen McHattie, tells her that they've done what they can and shows her face, now fitted with a pretty gnarly prosthetic. There are a number of powerful scenes of Laura Vandervoort just acting by herself that give us more sympathy for her character, including a visual homage to the bathroom scene from the original. In the remake, Rose seeks out the experimental treatment on her own. She chooses the transhumanism clinic. She agrees to the procedure, which is performed in a Dead Ringer-style ritual. A nice touch. The procedure is a success, and even makes Rose's eyes work so that she doesn't have to feel unattractive and introverted anymore. Her life back on track and looking de-specced and fresh, she goes out to the club with Chelsea, where she shares drinks with some folks at the bar. The rabies transmission is covered quickly and effectively. The Soskas take a page from Shyamalan's book and use the color red throughout the film as a warning of things to come. From here, we hit a number of the same beats as the original, but with more emphasis on Rose's character. For instance, the fur coat makes a return as she hunts former professional wrestler CM Punk as he leaves the club. In the midst of all this, Rose makes several trips back to the transhumanism clinic for checkups with Dr. William Burroughs, whose name is a reference to the writer of the novel on which Naked Lunch is based. Being a doctor, she trusts him completely, and so doesn't take notice as he steadily gets more and more inappropriate with her. Some clever color coordinating shows splashes of red every time she's in the room, the napkin, the bottles, the painting. This color warning is further enforced by the costume decisions. Rose wears black during her initial visit when she is uncertain of the procedure, but every time after the surgery was a success, she wears innocent white. Contrast this with Dr. Burroughs, who wears a pure white lab coat in his first appearance, and then sheds his professionalism in purer colors until he ultimately meets with Rose for the final time at the clinic wearing black.
The armpit appendage doesn't make an appearance in the remake until the third act. Rose's infections are instead done through a series of dreamlike sequences. When it does show up, it's much larger and more violent than the original, and it affects its victims not only immediately but more grotesquely, as seen in a creature design done by Masters Effects out of Etobicoke in Toronto.
Gunter, seeing how confident Rose is now, allows her to design for his new line titled Schadenfreude, and Chelsea, in a dress designed by Rose, is going to close out the show. On the way there, however, Chelsea is attacked on the subway, a scene shown in the original, but not here. The show falls apart as expected, and Chelsea attacks Gunter before being gunned down by the police. Hart brings Rose back to the transhumanism clinic. Here we find out that Brad was keeping tabs on Rose the entire time while working for Burroughs. This ending is also where we see another major difference between Cronenberg and the Soska sisters' films. Rather than have Rose sacrifice herself for the greater good like she does in the original, Dr. Burroughs is instead revealed to be a Resident Evil-style villain who is intent on keeping Rose to replace his cancer-ridden, seemingly immortal wife that he couldn't cure, another solid effect by Master Effects.
The whole film is more violent than the original, partially due to the technical advancements made since 1977, but also in part due to the Soska style. If you've ever seen American Mary, the body horror doesn't go as far as it does in that film, but we do get a healthy dose, especially in the final act.
We get an ending equally as bleak as the original, wherein Rose tries to kill herself to spare her from a lifetime of being Burroughs' new wife, only to find out that she too is essentially immortal, and now trapped in his lair.
No.
A passing shot of Burroughs' map on the wall shows all the spots he's hit, one of course being Montreal. Now the movie isn't perfect, there are a few things that weren't my favorite. There's some clunky dialogue.
Nothing tastes as good as skinny feels.
We are talking about fashion. It's not Dateline.
And despite being shot in Toronto, the movie doesn't take place in Canada, as hospital bills are used as a driving force for Rose's decision-making, which is decidedly un-Canadian. Also, while Laura Vandervoort is a strong enough lead, and Rose's character development taking the forefront is great, that did mean that some of the side characters tended to get left behind.
The Rabid remake is an intriguing enough piece of feminist horror from a pair of directors who love the genre. There are numerous homages to Cronenberg's previous work throughout, and these serve as a love letter to his fans from his fans. Whether this works against itself and makes it a bit more exclusive, however, is another story. It's definitely not shot for shot, and I think it's different enough to warrant a watch. Until next time, I've been RJ, this has been Killer Canuck, and thanks for watching. Thanks for watching this remake comparison, and I guess brief history of remakes. If you liked what you saw, be sure to drop me a like and hit the subscribe button. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at RealKillerCanuck. If you like the tune playing in the background, be sure to check out Prodouji on SoundCloud and over at noiserecords.com. I'll leave a link in the description below. What did you think of the Rabid remake? What do you think of remakes in general? Let me know in the comment section. Until next time.